Hello and welcome to Soulspeak. Tonight, we're taking you to Willow Creek, a quiet town tucked between the Oregon pines, where the snow falls softly, and every porch glows with Christmas lights. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where everyone knows everyone, until one winter night, when the lights in a small yellow house kept shining long after everyone inside had gone silent. In December of 2002, Hannah Lowell, a 33-year-old art teacher and mother, was found murdered inside her home. Her hands were tied with Christmas lights. Her 6-year-old daughter was found alive, hiding in the corner. The case went cold for 2 decades, until a single strand of wire, tucked away in an evidence box, whispered the truth. This is Silent Lights. The murder on Willow Street. Willow Creek was the kind of town people stopped noticing. It sat quietly between pine-covered hills, wrapped in fog and routine. Winters there came early, pressing the air into silence. The only sounds were the hum of snow and the faint chime of Christmas lights swaying in the wind. People liked to say nothing bad ever happened in Willow Creek, but what they really meant was nothing bad had happened yet. That December, the Lowell's house looked like a postcard, small, yellow, with peeling white trim and a porch swing that hadn't moved in years. Inside, warmth glowed against the frostbitten glass. A child's laughter rang out, soft, fleeting, the sound of a family that wanted to be fine. Hannah Lowell stood near the living room window, balancing on a chair as she looped strands of Christmas lights across the frame, each bulb lit with a faint click, red, green, gold, their reflections trembling in the glass. She adjusted one, then another, until the row looked perfectly even. Behind her, little Emma ran in circles, her socks sliding on the wooden floor. She hummed something tuneless and happy, a sound that filled the small house like sunlight. Hannah smiled without looking back. Her body moved automatically, hang, twist, secure, while her thoughts drifted elsewhere. The rhythm of routine was a comfort, a disguise for the weight she'd been carrying. There were mornings she woke up and felt a stillness inside her chest, a pause before her heartbeat caught up, like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. From the kitchen, the heater coughed, then steadied. The radio played an old Bing Crosby song, its melody faint and crackling. The scent of cinnamon candles hung in the air. It was almost enough to believe that everything was fine. Outside, a car engine rumbled, Daniel's truck pulling into the driveway. Hannah stepped down from the chair and brushed off her hands just as the door opened. Cold air slipped inside, sharp against the warmth. Daniel's boots were caked with slush, his jacket heavy with the smell of motor oil. He looked tired, older than 35 should look. His life had become a cycle of late shifts and early mornings, of promises he meant to keep but never did. He leaned against the doorframe, watching his wife adjust the lights. There was something fragile about her, a quiet grace that hadn't dulled even after years of small disappointments. He told her he'd have to stop by the shop again that evening, just for a quick check on the night crew. Hannah nodded without turning around. The motion was small, practiced. She didn't argue. She never did. When he left, the house exhaled. The hum of the engine faded into the distance, swallowed by snow and pine. For a long moment, Hannah stood by the window, watching flakes drift under the streetlight. Each one landed softly, soundless, covering the old tire tracks on the road until they disappeared. Emma had gone quiet, absorbed in her crayons at the coffee table. The only sound left was the low crackle of the heater, the occasional groan of old wood settling in the cold. Then 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. She hesitated before opening the door. Eli Turner stood on the porch, his breath fogging in the night air. Snow dusted his jacket and the brim of his cap. He was smiling, that easy, practiced smile that seemed to mean nothing and too much at the same time. In his hands, a small box wrapped in red paper. He said it was for Emma, a little Christmas surprise. Hannah thanked him, though her voice was tight. She didn't like the way he looked at her, how his eyes seemed to linger, not in admiration, but in possession. There was history there, unspoken and carefully buried, a wrong memory she'd chosen not to remember. Eli stepped just inside the doorway to hand the gift to Emma, who beamed and ran off to open it. He stayed standing, one hand still on the doorframe, like he wanted to come further but knew he shouldn't. The smell of his cologne reached her, metallic, clean, almost sterile. It clung to the air too long after he spoke. He made a small comment about the lights, how they made the house glow like something out of a magazine. Hannah murmured something polite in return, avoiding his eyes. She didn't see the point in asking why he was really there. When he finally left, she locked the door, not out of habit but instinct, the kind of lock that clicks twice, firm, like a statement. Outside, snow kept falling. The tire tracks from his truck disappeared as soon as the taillights faded. Inside, Hannah turned off the radio and checked the windows. The house had gone too quiet again. Emma sat cross-legged on the rug, unwrapping her gift, a small wooden music box painted blue, with a tiny ballerina inside. When wound, it played a soft, slow tune that sounded almost sad. Hannah knelt beside her and smiled, though her stomach had tightened into a knot she couldn't untangle later. When Emma had fallen asleep, Hannah walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. The glow of the Christmas bulbs on the window was the last to go. They flickered once, then steadied warm against the cold glass. For a while, she stood there, watching her reflection in the window pane. Behind her, the living room looked ordinary, tidy, small, quiet. Yet something about the stillness felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. She thought about calling Daniel, asking when he'd be home, but she didn't want to sound needy. He hated that word, needy. So she just waited. At 8:12, the phone rang once, then stopped. She assumed it was him. By 9, the snow had thickened into a wall of white outside. She drew the curtains, dimmed the lights, and made her way to Emma's room. The little girl slept soundly, clutching the music box in her hands. Hannah brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, whispering good night. The melody had stopped, but she could still hear it in her mind, that fragile, haunting tune that didn't quite resolve. She returned to the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at the lights glowing faintly through the curtains. Her thoughts wandered to Daniel, to work, to Eli's eyes at the door. She didn't realize how late it was until she noticed the clock. 10:03 p.m. outside. A car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly cutting through the snow before vanishing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then silence again. She thought she heard something, a faint creak from the back of the house, like the sound of old wood shifting, but it could have been anything. The cold, the wind, the house itself, settling. She sat still for a long time, listening. Her pulse slowed again, and then she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow dot from where she stood. The world seemed peaceful, soft, untouched. The kind of night that makes you forget what fear feels like. She didn't know that less than 12 hours later, that peace would be gone, that the lights she hung so carefully would still be glowing, long after the laughter had faded from the house. For now, though Willow Creek slept, the snow kept falling, and in that little yellow house, the warmth of the evening lingered, fragile, temporary, the calm before the storm. Snow had fallen steadily since late afternoon, covering Willow Creek in a muted white. The town's usual hum, the distant drone of engines, the occasional bark of a dog was all but gone, absorbed by the thick, cold quiet. Only the Lowell's house remained vivid, its yellow walls and Christmas lights glowing like a stubborn promise against the dark. Inside, the air was still, holding the faint warmth of the day. Hannah moved through the house with the slow, deliberate motions of someone performing a ritual, extinguishing lamps, checking locks, adjusting curtains. Emma had fallen asleep hours earlier, curled tightly around her small music box, the tiny ballerina frozen mid-spin. The room smelled faintly of wax crayons and the lingering sweetness of candles, a remnant of morning routines now overshadowed by something Hannah could not name. Daniel's absence weighed on her. His call had gone unanswered, leaving her with a quiet anxiety she could neither dispel nor articulate. She wandered the living room, tracing the edges of the sofa, touching the glass of the windows as though she could feel the world beyond them. The snow outside refracted streetlights into shards, scattering tiny prisms across the floor. Each reflection felt like a fragile, fleeting thing she might lose if she blinked. The house settled around her, floorboards groaning, old plumbing releasing sudden sharp sighs, heater pipes rattling in the silence. But beneath these ordinary sounds, Hannah felt a tension that was altogether unnatural, like the space itself was waiting. Her pulse accelerated subtly, a rhythm she tried to suppress. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Then came the sound she could not ignore, a slow, deliberate creak from the hallway. Not the house, not the wind, but steps. Someone moving with careful control, as if studying the layout, memorizing the obstacles. She froze, every muscle taut, ears straining. The house no longer felt familiar. A shadow appeared at the edge of the living room, tall and angular in the glow of the Christmas lights. Hannah recognized the outline, the curve of shoulders and the posture. It was a figure she knew, or thought she did. Recognition brought not relief, but dread. The attack was swift and efficient. Hands, cold and determined, seized her. Strands of lights were used to bind her wrists, the bulbs throwing fractured shapes across her skin. The intruder moved with a knowledge of the house she could not have anticipated, pulling her into the center of the living room, away from the bedroom where Emma slept. clothing tore under the strain, the scent of iron mingling with faint traces of candle wax and winter air. Emma awoke with a start. Her small form slipped from the bed, gripping the music box as if it were a shield. She crouched on the sofa, wide-eyed, watching shadows move, her body tense with instinctive fear. She understood nothing of the specifics, yet her gut screamed that the space around her had been corrupted. Hannah struggled silently, the fight draining quickly against the intruder's experience. Her mind, racing, tried to catalogue the intruder's movements, the way the lights glinted off his coat, the angle of his approach. Each detail embedded itself in her memory, a repository of fear she would never erase. Outside, the snow continued in thick, relentless layers. By midnight, the first reports of footprints and tire tracks vanished under the storm's cover. The town remained unaware, moving in its usual patterns of indifference. Only the Lowell's house held the imprint of the night's horror. When the first neighbor noticed the door ajar in the early morning, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The soft hum of the television continued, casting uneven light across the living room. Police arrived soon after, boots pressing into snow softened by hours of snowfall. Their examination was methodical, the position of the furniture, the faint smudge on the floor, the angle of the curtains, every element suggested a perpetrator who knew the home intimately. Hannah lay in the living room, her body still bound, her posture a quiet statement of the violence inflicted upon her. Blood traced patterns across the floorboards, deliberate yet chaotic. The lights she had strung in the morning remained aglow, their distorted colors reflecting the horror, mocking the ordinary life that had once filled the rooms. Emma remained on the sofa, gripping the music box so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned every corner of the room. For her, the world had narrowed into the immediacy of fear. Each shadow amplified, each sound exaggerated. Detectives moved slowly, observing every detail. No locks had been forced, no windows broken. The absence of obvious intrusion narrowed their suspicion. The killer had been known to the family. Every movement, every footprint, every displaced object spoke to familiarity, to intent. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, illuminating the living room in pale, distorted rays. Dust motes floated in the glow, as though suspended in time, silent witnesses to the night's events. The smell of iron lingered in the air, mixed with faint traces of perfume or cologne, subtle enough to suggest proximity without naming a source. Outside, Willow Creek continued, as though nothing had happened. Snowplows pushed through streets, children trudged to school, and the town's routines carried on. But the equilibrium had shifted. The calm of the town was fragile now, punctuated by an invisible tension, a knowledge that darkness could infiltrate even the most familiar places. Inside the Lowell's house, every detail held new meaning. The music box, once a token of joy, became a talisman. Every ornament and strand of lights was a reminder of what had been violated. Shadows stretched unnaturally, reflections fractured in impossible angles, and the warm glow of the bulbs carried the memory of terror rather than comfort. Emma would remember the night in fragments, the glint of lights across her mother's skin, the harsh scent of metal, the trembling of her own hands. Police notes and reports would catalogue the facts, but none could capture the emotional weight, the psychological imprint that lingered long after the blood had been cleaned. Hannah's life, meticulously ordered, had ended in chaos. Her routines, her small gestures of care, and her attempt to preserve normalcy had been violently disrupted. Every object in the house now carried the residue of her absence. The investigation would begin with the evidence visible to the eye, the blood, the bindings, the footprints, but the truth would lie in subtler details, the timing of movements, the small inconsistencies in the intruder's pattern, the psychological signatures left in place of broken locks or forced entry. By midday, the snow had slowed, leaving the house and street blanketed in an indifferent, white stillness. The contrast between the serenity outside and the horror within was stark. The Christmas lights, still burning, reflected off the snow, creating distorted shadows across the walls, reminders that the world carried on unaware, while within the yellow walls, life and innocence had been violently severed. The detective in charge noted every anomaly, the angle of the sofa, the small cut on Emma's forehead, the absence of defensive wounds from Hannah beyond her bindings, the way the lights reflected against the floorboards. Each was a piece of a puzzle that suggested a cold, deliberate, intimate act, not a crime of opportunity, but of premeditated precision. The weight of the night lingered, pressing down on the house, on the child, and on the town itself. Willow Creek had been violated, its perception of safety shattered. The lights Hannah had strung with care were still glowing stubbornly in the window, a quiet, eerie testament that some presences cannot be erased, that some horrors leave a permanent trace on memory and environment. By evening, the house was cordoned off, and detectives had begun to piece together every witness, every neighbor, every observation would feed into an understanding of the crime. But even with meticulous investigation, the emotional resonance, the terror, the betrayal, the rupture of normal life could not be captured in a report or photograph. It existed in the air, in the angles of furniture, in the small, terrified motions of a child clutching a music box. Even as the town carried on around it, the Lowell's house remained suspended in that night's events. The snow softened the outside world, but inside, shadows clung to corners, lights glimmered unnaturally, and the echo of what had happened refused to fade. The story had been written in the details, in the stillness, the bindings, the fractured reflections of bulbs on glass, and in the silence of a small girl who had survived to witness the unimaginable. The investigation began with the most obvious suspect. Daniel Lowell, husband and father, was first on the police's list. His hand shook slightly as he recounted the events of the night, the memory of Emma's small, frightened face pressing at the back of his mind. Detective Carver noticed a streak of red on the sleeve of his jacket. Blood, one of the younger officers asked, already anticipating the accusation. Daniel's face tightened. Paint, he said simply. Later, lab analysis confirmed it. Red machine paint, the remnant of a project he had worked on earlier in the week. It wasn't blood, it wasn't evidence of guilt, but the tension in the interrogation room did not ease. Each minute Daniel spent recounting the evening, his alibi, the late shift at the shop, stretched the room's silence taut. Every pause felt heavier than it should. With Daniel ruled out, suspicion shifted outward, toward the neighbors. A routine check, casual interviews, questions about strange visitors, odd sounds, anything out of place. Each neighbor's movements, each answer, each hesitation was catalogued, weighed, and dismissed. They were all accounted for. The intrusion was not random, and the fingerprints of familiarity could be traced to only a handful of individuals. The detectives moved slowly, methodically. Every scrap of evidence, every object in the house, every detail in Emma's and Hannah's rooms was catalogued. But the trail was cold. Nothing connected outward. The crime had been executed with intimate knowledge of the house and its occupants. Whoever had done this had known the routines, the quiet habits, the vulnerabilities. That it was in Hannah's diary that the investigators finally found a thread worth following. Stacked neatly on a shelf, the small book bore familiar scrawls, thoughts written in hurried cursive. Amid notes about art projects, grocery lists, and holiday preparations, one line stood out: E. Lehon Ham Ne. T-Th, S-D, and M-T, N-A. Detective Carver read it slowly, the words lingering in the air of the room. Emma's little music box sat nearby, its ballerina frozen mid-spin, a quiet witness to the words. E. Carver murmured. A name, a fragment, a hint of the person Hannah had feared. The diary made clear that her anxiety had been present long before the night's tragedy. It was subtle, buried among ordinary life, but unmistakable to those who sought meaning in absence. Someone known to Hannah, someone whose presence unsettled her deeply. Further interviews with friends and co-workers yielded nothing more. Hannah had mentioned nothing to Daniel, and her friends remembered only polite smiles and casual small talk. There was no report of threats, no unusual phone calls, nothing that could have prepared anyone for the violence that had erupted in the Lowell's home. The investigation began to feel like chasing shadows. Each lead was cold, each theory hit a wall. The house remained a sealed mystery. The lights Hannah had hung glowing stubbornly in photographs and memories, as though mocking the police's inability to penetrate the night's events. Emma's testimony was careful, limited, fragmented. Her young mind could not articulate the danger, only the fear and confusion. The way shadows had moved, the way the intruder had seemed almost part of the house itself. Detectives tread lightly, aware that every question could fracture her fragile sense of safety further. Hours and days passed. For the investigators, the case was a maze with no exit. Every known avenue led to a wall, every suspect cleared, every clue ambiguous. The diary's cryptic line, the reference to E, became the sole thread tying the events to the realm of the known, yet it was tenuous. Frustratingly so. Outside the yellow house, the town moved on. Snow thawed and refroze, footprints disappeared, streetlights flickered through misty evenings. Willow Creek appeared unchanged, ordinary, untouched by the violence within. yet the house remained different, frozen in time, a repository of terror and absence, where the glow of Christmas lights had become an emblem of memory, of fear, and of the unspoken presence that had haunted Hannah before her death. Detective Carver studied the diary again, turning pages carefully, absorbing each mundane note, each fleeting detail. That single sentence stood out, a beacon among trivialities. The investigators knew that somewhere in the town, in the routines of the familiar, lay the key to understanding. But finding it was another matter entirely. Each day brought new frustrations. Leads ran dry. The red paint on Daniel's jacket had been a false start. Neighbors offered nothing, and physical evidence in the house yielded no fingerprint, no trace DNA beyond the obvious. The perpetrator had moved with knowledge, with precision, leaving only the shadow of intent behind. And all the while, Emma watched, and remembered, the quiet house, the glow of lights, the sound of her mother's voice silenced forever, each fragment stored carefully, imprinted for the future. Her memory would carry the story forward. Small details unnoticed by others but vivid to her. Waiting for someone patient enough to connect them, the investigation had reached a dead end. Suspicion was narrowed but inconclusive. The diaries hinted, memories held clues, but nothing concrete emerged. Willow Creek, for the first time in its history, felt fragile, uncertain, as though the boundary between safety and violation had been permanently blurred. In the yellow house, the lights Hannah had strung so carefully continued to glow. Their stubborn warmth, a quiet, haunting reminder, the truth existed somewhere, but the path to it was hidden, tangled in fear, familiarity, and the shadows of people who knew too much and said too little. The detectives had a name, a fragment, and a diary. That was all, and the deeper they looked, the more it became clear that the answers lay not in the obvious, not in the chaos of the crime scene, but in the subtle, intimate knowledge that someone had brought inside the house, someone who had observed, waited, and then struck. Willow Creek had survived for decades on routine, on small habits, on the illusion of safety. That illusion was gone, and now the detectives faced the most difficult task, to follow the faintest shadow, to question the familiar, to confront a truth that might be closer and far more dangerous than they could imagine. The summons arrived quietly, almost casually, as though the law itself preferred to ease into tension. Eli Turner had lived in the periphery of the Lowells' lives for years, a neighbor, a friend, a familiar face whose presence hovered just beyond ordinary interactions. Now, he was being called in, formally, as a person of interest. Detective Carver watched from across the observation room as Eli entered the station. The man's movements were precise, measured, almost rehearsed. His hands were clasped in front of him, his eyes steady, but there was a subtle tension around the jaw, a micro-expression betraying unease. Carver had learned to notice these things, subtle tells that hinted at discomfort, guilt, or the careful management of secrets. Eli claimed the night of Hannah Lowell's murder had found him at home with Claire. Her name, softly spoken in the sterile room, carried a weight, the weight of corroboration. She repeated the story with the kind of calm that seemed practiced, a gentle affirmation of normality. Detective Carver listened, not with disbelief, but with the patience of someone cataloging shadows. Every pause, every glance, every slight hesitation mattered. Each was a piece of a puzzle that may or may not exist. Then came the footage. A neighbor's security camera, installed for ordinary caution, had captured a fleeting glimpse of a truck turning into the block where the Lowells lived. The footage was grainy, the image dark, snowflakes drifting in front of the lens like tiny phantoms, yet the silhouette, the size, the contours, the unmistakable profile matched Eli's vehicle. Carver replayed it again and again, frame by frame. The truck appeared, paused, and disappeared. The driver's identity was obscured by darkness, by distance, by the limitations of technology, yet the presence was undeniable. Eli, or someone like him, had been there. His presence that night could not be ignored, but neither did it prove his involvement in the act itself. The physical evidence offered no clarity. DNA extracted from Hannah's body was too small in quantity for the technology of 2002 to analyze definitively. Blood patterns, fibers, fingerprints, all were catalogued, photographed, measured, yet none pointed decisively toward the intruder. It was a meticulous crime, executed with knowledge and precision, leaving only shadows where clarity should have been. In the interviews that followed, every detail of Eli's movements was scrutinized. Carver asked questions about routine, errands, stops, and phone calls. Each answer was measured, yet there remained a faint tension, a gap between what was said and what might have been unsaid. The diary Hannah had kept became central, a line scrawled months earlier, a quiet warning in her handwriting, Leihan Humne, TTSD and MTNCA. The diary had sat quietly on a shelf, overlooked until investigators turned to it. Now, each page seemed to carry weight, each observation a latent clue. Hannah had felt fear. It had been subtle, personal, intimate, the kind of fear that leaves no visible mark but imprints on memory. Eli's presence, his gaze, the history they shared, all of it coalesced into a single fragment of suspicion, impossible to ignore, impossible to prove. Days stretched into weeks. The investigation moved like a slow current, threading through details that yielded nothing tangible. Neighbors were questioned again, alibis double-checked, timelines reconstructed. Each line of inquiry led to another wall of uncertainty. The evidence was circumstantial, fleeting, a whisper of possibility without substance. The more Carver examined, the more he realized the complexity of intimacy and crime. Whoever had entered the Lowells' house that night had done so with knowledge, a sense of timing, of movement, of familiarity. The house itself was a map of private routines, and the perpetrator navigated it as if it were second nature. Every corner, every light switch, every creak in the floorboards had been anticipated. The psychological weight of the case pressed on Carver and his team. Each revisit to the diary, each replay of the truck on the grainy camera footage, was a reminder that the answer might be close, intimate, terrifying in its familiarity. Eli could be innocent, he could be guilty. The thin line between suspicion and proof had never felt more cruelly drawn. For Daniel, the days that followed were hollow. The strain of grief mixed with the subtle, unspoken suspicion that lingered around Eli, even as Daniel went about his work and cared for Emma. The shadow of doubt pressed against routine, quiet but unyielding. It did not take form in accusations or confrontations, only in the subtle tension in his movements. The way he watched for patterns that might confirm his fears. Emma remained largely removed from the intricacies of suspicion, yet the psychological imprint was present. She watched adults move through the house with careful deliberation, observed the small signs of tension, the whispered conversations, the pauses, the way people avoided certain topics. Even a child could sense the invisible web of unease, the threads of questions that had no answers. That as the investigation dragged on, Carver convened meetings with colleagues, dissecting every fragment of evidence. The truck footage was analyzed for angle, speed, and timing. Eli's alibi was verified repeatedly, each confirmation narrowing the field of suspicion but never resolving it. The DNA evidence, limited by technology, could not provide certainty. And Hannah's diary, while emotionally compelling, offered no legal grounds for indictment. Weeks became months. The town's rhythm resumed, the ordinary life of Willow Creek pressing against the lingering uncertainty. Children played in thawing snow, streetlights flickered to life in early evenings. Neighbors exchanged greetings that were polite but cautious. The Lowells' house stood quiet, the yellow walls faded slightly under months of sun and frost. The lights Hannah had hung remained packed away, a ghostly reminder of the events that had shattered ordinary life. Eventually, the case was closed administratively. Cold case, the files read, a label that sought to contain grief and ambiguity, to file away the uncertainty into a compartment of bureaucratic order. Yet for those who had lived it, for Detective Carver, for Daniel, for Emma, closure did not come. The unresolved tension, the intimate familiarity of the crime, lingered like a shadow across memory. Carver revisited the footage on quiet evenings, replaying the truck's approach, noting snow patterns and fleeting shadows. He read Hannah's diary, absorbing the mundane alongside the terrifying, searching for a clue overlooked, a detail that might have been dismissed too soon. Each frame, each line of writing, each micro-expression in recorded interviews became a repository of possibility, a reminder that the truth was often just beyond reach. Eli returned to his routine, outwardly unaffected, but the subtle weight of suspicion followed him like a faint, invisible tether. Every glance from a neighbor, every polite interaction, carried an unspoken question: had he been present that night? And if so, why? The tension was silent, but relentless. Daniel and Emma lived in a fragile equilibrium. The ordinary routines of daily life overlaid with a subtle vigilance. Every creak in the floor, every unaccounted sound, every moment of quiet was a reminder that the night's horror had not been resolved, that the boundaries of safety had been irrevocably blurred. The Lowells' yellow house became a monument to unresolved terror. Every corner, every room, every reflection and shadow carried memory and absence. The lights, the ornaments, even the faint traces of Hannah's routines remained etched into consciousness, a reminder that some presences of guilt, fear, and intimacy refused to be extinguished, and so the case settled into history as a cold file, a cautionary tale of proximity, suspicion, and the unrelenting ambiguity of human behavior. For Carver, for the family, and for Willow Creek, the crime was neither solved nor forgotten. It lingered in shadows, in fragments of memory, and in the quiet spaces between routine and vigilance. Even as seasons changed, even as the snow melted and returned, even as the town carried on unaware, the Lowell story persisted. Every subtle movement, every quiet observation, every reflection of light in the empty house whispered of that night, of the suspect who had been present yet untouched by law, and of a terror that remained intimately, impossibly close. 20 years had passed. Willow Creek had aged quietly, its streets smoothed by snow and traffic, its houses weathered by time. Yet the memory of that night lingered like an echo in the town's collective consciousness. The yellow Lowell house, long empty and shuttered, stood mute against the winter sky. Its windows were dark, the paint faded, the porch swing hanging still. No lights flickered there anymore, no laughter floated from within. But in the sterile halls of the State Forensic Laboratory, the story had never truly ended. Dr. May Collins was young, precise, and meticulous. She approached cold cases with a combination of scientific rigor and empathy, an understanding that the traces she examined were not just evidence, but fragments of lives irrevocably altered. When the Lowell file was placed on her desk, she paused, letting her fingers trace the edges of the manila folder. The papers within were brittle, yellowed with age, filled with reports, witness statements, and photographs that captured frozen moments of terror. May's attention went immediately to the small paper bag labeled Evidence Christmas Lights, Victim Bindings. The bag was old, crumpled, yet intact, the strands of lights still coiled within. She handled them carefully, aware that these wires, once instruments of violence, were now keys to truth. Gloves on, she separated each bulb, each wire, observing the subtle traces that decades of storage could not erase. Forensics had advanced in ways unimaginable in 2002. DNA extraction, once limited to substantial samples, could now detect and amplify microscopic residues, traces invisible to the human eye. May knew that within these wires, the history of that night might still cling. She worked methodically, cataloging, photographing, and preparing the samples for analysis. Days passed. The lab hummed quietly, the refrigeration unit steady, machines blinking softly like slow heartbeats. May reviewed the case files repeatedly, internalizing the details. Hannah Lowell's diary, her notes about fear, her subtle warnings, the neighbor's grainy camera footage of a dark truck turning into the block that night, the statements from Daniel, neighbors, and Eli Turner. Every fragment mattered. Every shadow, every glance, every hesitation in witness statements was a clue when interpreted with patience. Finally, the results returned. May stared at the screen, her eyes widening despite years of experience. 2 DNA profiles were detected. One was obvious, Hannah Lowell. The other was unmistakable, complete, perfect. Eli Turner, long dead, succumbing quietly to cancer in 2018. The man who had haunted Hannah's diary entries, whose presence had sparked fear that she could not articulate, whose truck had appeared on camera near the house that night. He had been there, undeniably, intimately connected to the crime that had shattered a family and a town. May leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The sterile lab felt suddenly charged with weight. The faint hum of the equipment transformed into a drumbeat echoing the past. This was the truth, clear, undeniable, yet carrying no justice. Eli Turner was beyond the reach of law, beyond confrontation, beyond accountability. She revisited the diary once more. Every page seemed to vibrate with the prescience of Hannah's fear. Elay Hunham Ne, TTSD and MTNHTA. It was no longer a vague warning. It was a documented acknowledgement of threat, of danger, of a presence that had been intimate and invasive. Hannah had known, in the depths of her mind, that someone she knew, someone familiar, carried with them the potential for violence. May felt a chill, imagining Hannah's awareness. The weight of fear that had pressed against her chest every day, unnoticed by those around her. The implications extended beyond scientific verification. May considered Daniel, the widower who had lived for decades under suspicion by default, who had carried grief and doubt quietly alongside the raising of Emma. She considered Emma herself, now an adult, whose childhood had been shaped by terror and confusion, whose memory contained fragments too vivid to ignore. The revelation would not undo the trauma. It would only illuminate its source coldly without comfort. May documented the findings meticulously. Every detail, every sequence of testing, every note about contamination, control, chain of custody, and amplification process was logged. The report would stand as a definitive record, a forensic certainty in a case long buried. But the weight of it, the personal, human weight, could not be archived. Outside the lab, Willow Creek remained oblivious. Children walked home from school, streets gleamed with thawing snow. The town moved with the mundane rhythm of years that had passed. But inside the lab, the past felt immediate, pressing. May imagined the yellow house, quiet and shuttered, the faint outlines of the rooms where fear had played out. She pictured the living room, Hannah struggling with the lights, the bindings, the intimate threat of Eli's presence. She imagined Emma clutching her music box, eyes wide in terror. The scene was frozen in her mind, vivid and precise. The glow of the lights replaced by the clinical clarity of science. May pondered the timing, the methodology, the audacity of Eli's act. The man had been careful, meticulous, intimate in his knowledge of the house, yet reckless in the trust he violated. He had operated under the assumption that his presence would remain invisible, unprovable. 2 decades had proven otherwise, though justice in the conventional sense was now impossible. The revelation rippled silently through the archives. May filed the report, ensured that the evidence, the Christmas lights, the photographic documentation, the amplified DNA samples, was secured. In the sterile air of the lab, she imagined the conversations that might occur decades too late, discussions of missed warning signs, of fear documented yet unheeded, of a town that had never fully realized the danger within its borders. And still, some things remained unanswerable. Why had Eli Turner done it? What had driven him into the Lowell's home? To bind Hannah, to terrify a child, to leave a life shattered. The diary offered insight into fear, presence, and foreboding, but not motive. Science could confirm identity, but it could not articulate intent, morality, or the human impulses that had led to murder. May left the lab briefly, stepping into the winter twilight. Snow fell softly, brushing rooftops and streets. The yellow house on Willow Street remained visible in the distance, dark and silent, its secrets intact, its shadows preserved by time. The lights Hannah had strung so carefully 2 decades prior were gone, but their memory persisted, an echo that refused to fade. Back inside, May considered Emma Lowell. She was no longer a child. She had grown into adulthood carrying memories and fragments of fear that would never fully be resolved. The confirmation of Eli Turner's DNA would bring clarity, yes, but it would also reopen old wounds. May thought of how to present the information sensitively, aware that forensic certainty could bring both relief and renewed pain. The lab grew quiet. Machines hummed, samples sealed, records filed. Yet the psychological weight of the case, the intimacy of the crime, the long-delayed revelation lingered. May felt it pressing against the sterile walls, as palpable as the cold outside. Some truths arrive late, silent, unyielding, and irrevocable. They illuminate what was hidden but do not heal what was broken. 20 years after the night that changed Willow Creek, the truth was finally visible. Eli Turner had been there. Eli Turner had committed the act. And the town, the family, the memory of Hannah Lowell all carried the weight of that revelation, indelibly, hauntingly, without resolution in the ordinary sense. Even as the snow continued to fall, soft and indifferent, May could almost see the faint, imagined glow of those Christmas lights, stubborn and persistent, across decades. They flickered in memory, illuminating a crime whose shadows had finally been pierced by time and technology, yet whose emotional resonance, the fear, the loss, the lingering presence of terror remained eternal. The cold case was no longer cold. The answer was in the strands of wire, in the amplified DNA, in the meticulous care of a young technician willing to look where others had not. The story, though concluded scientifically, would echo in the lives of those left behind, in the quiet streets of Willow Creek, and in the haunting memory of a night that had refused to be forgotten. And in that echo, the town, the house, the family, and the memory of Hannah lingered, persistent, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. The news reached Claire quietly at first, a letter from the state lab, delivered with the precision of bureaucracy yet carrying the weight of decades. She unfolded it with trembling hands, reading words that would unravel a lifetime of denial. Eli Turner, DNA confirmation, 20 years. Claire sank to the edge of her bed, the paper trembling against her fingers. She remembered now the argument she had witnessed between Eli and Hannah so long ago. It had been sharp, heated, voices raised in a winter night, the kind of confrontation adults think children cannot hear but inevitably do. At the time she had turned away, dismissed it as a private quarrel, nothing that could endanger a life. She had been wrong. Memories came rushing, Eli's shadow looming over the Lowell's porch. The tense way he had handled Hannah, the subtle control he exercised over her presence in the neighborhood. Small details she had ignored, brushed aside, seemed now like glaring warnings. Every instinct she had silenced in her youth returned with force, piercing the calm of her present. Outside, Willow Creek prepared for winter as it always did, streets lined with faint frost, the smell of pine from Christmas trees and wreaths drifting through the chilled air. But for the town, the murder that had haunted them silently for 2 decades was no longer invisible. Detective Carver, now older and grayer, convened the press, reopening the narrative in a careful, deliberate manner. The town gathered, whispers growing into low murmurs, a mixture of curiosity, fear, and the long-suppressed grief of memory. The yellow Lowell house remained shuttered, yet a crowd gathered on Willow Street, drawn by the need for acknowledgement, for closure, for the unspoken reckoning with fear. Candles were placed in windows, small lights glowing against the darkening winter evening. And at the town square, a ritual began. The people of Willow Creek, friends and strangers alike, turned on Christmas lights in unison. The glow was hesitant, flickering in the rain that had begun to fall lightly. Each bulb reflected on wet cobblestones, refracted in puddles, trembling like a heartbeat against the night. For some, it was remembrance. For others, atonement. The lights, once symbols of celebration, now bore the weight of memory, illuminating both what had been lost and the courage to confront it. Emma, grown into a young woman, stood quietly among the crowd. She had returned to Willow Creek, a witness to the town's acknowledgement, yet her presence was more intimate than anyone else's. She thought of her mother, of the music box clutched in her small hands, of the warmth and fear intertwined in that yellow house. Her grief, tempered by decades of life lived in shadow, mixed with a strange relief, the certainty that the truth had finally emerged, that the name of her mother's killer was no longer a mystery. Claire approached Emma cautiously, offering apologies that words could never truly repair. They shared a brief, silent acknowledgement. The past, with all its pain, could not be rewritten, but it could now be seen in light, however flickering and fragile. Dr. May Collins, sitting in a small recording studio days later, recounted the case on a podcast devoted to the truth buried within crime. Her voice was steady, deliberate, carrying both fascination and empathy. The Lowell case, she said, was a reminder that light is not always what it seems. The strands of Christmas lights, once used to confine, now revealed the hidden shadows of our past. Sometimes, light does more than decorate. It illuminates, it uncovers, it exposes the darkness we thought long buried. Listeners across the country imagined the quiet town, the yellow house, the snow, and the fragile glow of lights against a winter night. They imagined the fear and courage intertwined, the small details, the diary, the music box, the truck on the street coalescing into a story of intimacy, betrayal, and finally, revelation. Willow Creek itself, now accustomed to the ritual of remembrance, began to heal in subtle ways. The town square's lights continued to shine long after the rain had stopped, reflections dancing against wet stones. They were a quiet acknowledgement that tragedy could not be undone, but its truth could be honored. That memory, like the lights themselves, could flicker, persist, and guide. In her quiet office, May reviewed her notes one final time. The case was closed in the eyes of the law. Eli Turner identified, his actions confirmed, the truth irrefutable. Yet she understood closure in paper and evidence did not erase human memory, trauma, or grief. What it did offer was recognition, a town, a family, and a story finally aligned with reality. Emma walked past the yellow house one evening, snowflakes settling on her coat. The building remained abandoned, yet the faintest flicker of remembered light seemed to cling to its windows. She paused, thinking of her mother, of the fear, of the moments that had been stolen, and of the strength it had taken to survive. She whispered a quiet farewell, not for vengeance, not for justice, but for acknowledgement. The night was silent, the snow unbroken, and for the first time in decades, the sense of haunting seemed to soften, if only slightly. As May's voice resonated through the podcast speakers, she concluded, sometimes the stories we think we've lost are merely waiting for technology, for patience, and for courage to reveal them. And sometimes, the smallest light can illuminate a truth hidden for a lifetime. The lights we see may be faint, flickering, even fragile, but they can still guide us out of darkness. Outside, Willow Creek remained quiet. Snow settled softly on rooftops and streets. The town had seen tragedy, fear, and the intimate violence hidden behind familiarity. Now, it had seen truth, and in that light, however fragile and fleeting, a sense of peace, tentative, cautious, enduring, began to take root. The Christmas lights on the square flickered in the rain one last time, like a heartbeat, like a memory, like a signal to the living that some truths, even after decades, could finally be acknowledged. And in the quiet, the yellow house, the streets, and the townspeople held their collective breath, remembering, mourning, and, finally, beginning to heal. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The screen lingers on the quiet, snow-covered streets of Willow Creek. The faint glow of Christmas lights flickers, reflecting on wet pavement. A calm, reflective narration begins. Thank you for listening, for following the story of Willow Creek and the mystery of Hannah Lowell. Some stories leave shadows, some leave questions, but every story deserves to be heard. If you have a theory, a thought, or simply want to share your reflections, leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, please like the video and follow our channel. That way, you won't miss our upcoming true crime stories and mysteries. Remember, sometimes, even the smallest light can reveal what's been hidden for years. Keep watching, and stay curious. Fade out slowly, leaving the soft glow of Christmas lights and the quiet sound of falling snow.